Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and let's recap the March 2019 ChemKnits dialogue. Now, you might be wondering why I'm showing you guys the undyed yarn, and truth is, I am currently about to do the dialogue, so I don't even know what colors we will be creating yet. But since I have picked a gray heathered base and a tweed base, I just wanted to show what the bare yarns started out looking like, so that way when we see the final colors, we have something to compare it to. Tonight I am going to be dyeing a colorway inspired by a curious fox. And I'm just really excited to play with these oranges, browns, blacks, grays, and hints of a deep, deep green. This Dove Heather Big O is a yarn that has made an appearance in a couple of the dialogues so far. It is 50% Superwash Merino, 50% Nylon. I have never dyed woodland tweed before, but these neps that are black and brown felt like it worked really well with this woodland fox. Woodland tweed is 80% merino, 15% baby alpaca, and 5% viscose, which is what gives us these lovely neps. Knit Pick Stroll Fingering Weight yarn is a yarn that we use very frequently around here. It is 75% Superwash Merino, 25% nylon. But I'm also adding in 2 yarn bases that I think I'm going to play with tonight that come from Dyer Supplier. This is the Bare yarn supplier that's associated with Knit Crate, and they sent me some of their 75% Superwash Merino, 25% nylon base, plus their high twist 80% Superwash Merino, 20% nylon base. Now, to be perfectly honest, looking at the 2 of these out of the pack, it's really, really hard for me to tell which one is which, but I don't know if we'll see any differences as we dye them. I added a little acrylic tie on one of the ties of the Yarn Undyed 75-25 sock yarn, so that way I could tell the difference between it and the 80-20. First impressions wise, I would say that the dyed yarns feel very, very silky and soft, and I really enjoy the way they feel. The yarns feel a tad, or look a tad stretched out than Knit Pick's Stroll Fingering Weight yarn. If I zoom in to compare the Stroll with the 75-25, you can see that the Stroll fibers feel a little bit more fluffed up than the Dyer Supplier one. The same is true if I compare the 80-20 with the Stroll. I'm really curious to see if the yarns will fluff back up through dyeing and trip through my new Nina Soft spin dryer, but I sort of wanted to give this little impression of what we're working with before we go and look at the dyeing process and the final yarns. I have an idea of the colorway that I want to create, but I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to nail it on the first shot. So I am going to start off with the Dyer Supplier yarns and do sort of a little swatch type test where I'll be playing with some of the dye powders to sort of get a sense of the proportions that I want to use of the different colors. And then my plan is to move on to the other yarn bases and play around with my goal colorway. Obviously, this is subject to change, but I thought it would be interesting for the recap this time to start with my idea and intent before I show you the finished result. Here are the colors that we created in the March ChemKnits Dye-Along live stream. Did I nail the depth and the darkness and the sort of toned down orange from my fox inspiration? Not really. My orange is a little brighter. It is a little bit more like fall leaf, but I think that if I were to name any of these colorways woodland creature, you would absolutely be able to see my inspiration. The yarns are laid out in sort of the order that they were dyed, and I'm going to go through each of them individually. But sort of looking at the greater picture, I think my favorites from just colorway perspective are the very first two that I dyed. I started off swatching a lot of the different acid dye colors that I thought we would bring in today, which included Tangelo, Fluorescent Safety Orange, Forest Green, maybe some Jacquard Brown, some Dharma Espresso Bean, and I believe some Twilight Gray, and maybe even some Silver Gray. I think those were in general the tones that I wanted to start with. And I started playing with them just to see how these colors played off each other, to get a sense of how I could layer these dry powders in a low immersion setup to create a colorway that would fit our inspiration. This is my first time playing with the 75-25 Superwash Merino Nylon and the 80-20 Superwash Merino Nylon from Dyer Supplier. As I showed the yarns at the beginning of this recap, you can see they plumped up beautifully through dyeing. When I took them out of the package, they did feel a tiny bit stretched out, and I mean, you could see even just from the length of the skeins how plump and beautiful the yarn looks now that it's dyed. So the 80-20 is a higher twist yarn than the 75-25. There's more yardage in this one than there is in this one. I'm not 100% sure if I can tell visually. Maybe looking closely, I think, oh yeah, I can see it, but it isn't super obvious. Therefore, if you ever have the opportunity to play with both of them, make sure that you label one of them, as I did here with a little acrylic tie, so that way I would know which base was which. I think that this is also a great opportunity to point out the fact that yardage can vary significantly through the dyeing process. Not that the yarns shrink, but yarns can stretch or bounce back, and so that definitely can make a difference if I were to go and measure this yarn now versus the skein that we had originally. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now we're going out of order a little bit to the very end, but I wanted to stay with the 75-25 and 80-20 sort of theme from the Dyer Supplier yarn bases. With this skein, I used it as a yarn mop. So as I was speckling, I would get dye on my gloves and then I would wipe them off onto here. Eventually I did add it to a dye bath so that way it could get some vinegar and we could set the color, but this whole colorway came about just by me randomly touching it with my gloves, and I think we ended up with something really nicely balanced and beautiful. In the end, I also had a bit of dye powder left over that I had aliquoted out for some of the speckling, and I believe that this really saturated color was a mixture of, I think, Jacquard Brown, just a little bit of that, but then mostly Dharma Espresso Bean and Twilight Gray. This is a yarn that is such a deep purple. It is almost brown. In some lights it does feel brown, but it really is a beautiful purple, and it is saturated, tonal, with some beautifully subtle speckles in there. Here's a little close-up so you can see some of those beautiful speckles. Finally, we dyed 3 yarn bases to try to achieve our foxy color. We used Knit Pick's Stroll Fingering Woodland Tweed, which is a heavy worsted weight, and then Big O, which started off in the color Dove Heather. I started with Fluorescent Safety Orange as the base, and I know, starting with a neon when our inspiration photo was this dark is a little silly, but I really was committed to trying to create this kind of inspiration with the dry powders I had on hand and layering the colors on top of each other. So I started with the Fluorescent Safety Orange, and then I added on some Tangelo, I think a mixture of Espresso Bean and Twilight Gray, and then maybe a little Silver Gray. I don't remember exactly, but these were the colors that I was again playing with. And I think that it's really interesting to see the overall differences between them, because this one has a lot more bright orange because those other colors were just striking that much faster. The woodland tweed yarn is not superwash, and so when we added these specks of colors, they spread out a lot more and gave us these patches of color. The Big O yarn is superwash, so we do have some more sharp speckles on there, but it started off as this gray, which means that the overall color started off a little toned down. So I think of all the yarns, the one that hit the inspiration the best is probably the Big O yarn. Maybe then followed by the woodland tweed, and then actually probably the very first two that I showed. I think the woodland tweed base is absolutely beautiful. I'm just not sure if with this technique, those neps really add a ton to the yarn. It's a little hard to see them because there's so many layers of color and flecks of color that these brown, black, and white flecks in the yarn itself are a little bit lost or camouflaged. I think it'll still knit beautifully, but if you really wanted to showcase these neps, you might be better off doing something that is a little more subtle overall, so that way they can sort of shine through a little bit. Now it is time for my favorite part, where I showcase some of the yarns that you all dyed inspired by the same inquisitive fox photo that I picked for March 2019. You submitted your pictures to me on Instagram and Facebook, and I wish that I could showcase everything that you guys dyed, but here are a few photos. It is so fun for me to see how many different kinds of colorways people can create, all looking from one photo. I know that when I pick these photos, I am trying to pull for something that will make me challenge myself, whether it's with a new technique that I'm inspired by or colors that I haven't played with in a kind of way before. And I don't know what I'm going to pick yet for next month, but make sure that you follow ChemKnits on Facebook and Instagram so that way you don't miss it. You can find the links to all my social media in the video description. I think if I was going to go for this again, I would probably choose a different technique. I love playing with the dry acid dye powder straight on a low immersion pan. But I think in this circumstance, to hit this orange, I didn't really have the right orange to achieve the colorway I was hoping to create in my head. And there are colors out there. I showed the Dharma color chart in the live stream. There's plenty of colors out there that would work if I had had them. But since I didn't, and I did have access to probably 20 or so different colors, I think I could have mixed an orange that would have been closer to my inspiration. And then I could have created a colorway still low immersion, maybe even still layered, but using pre-mixed colors that I mixed myself. I think that this is why that if you are running a shop and you want to create a new colorway, start small, don't do a huge batch all at once, and play with the colors. Layer them, see what happens, and try a technique. If it doesn't work, you might have an awesome one of a kind before you shift gears. But it's hard to know. You can design and design and design in your head, but it's hard to know until you actually start putting dye to yarn how the colors will turn out. So my advice is always to go for it, play, experiment, and use that to hone in the hues that you really want to play with. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and make sure that you subscribe to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel and tap that bell icon to turn on notifications so you don't miss a new live stream. I love doing these dye-alongs, and I cannot wait to see what we all create next month. If you are already a huge ChemKnits fan and you want to support us on another level, check out the ChemKnits Patreon. ChemKnits patrons get early access to new content, exclusive behind-the-scenes sneak peeks, and more. You can find the links in the video description and iCard. And most of all, thank you so much for tuning in, watching these long dyeing live streams along with me, and joining in on the fun at home. I am so glad that you guys requested that we do these dye-alongs, and I cannot wait to challenge myself again next month. Thank you so much for watching, everyone.